the bachelor came to the city and had a job but didn't yet have a wife, so the landlady would maybe wash his sheets and towels and maybe provide, dinner for him when he came home from work. So there was a huge variety of housing choices available to single adults, some of which became awful, and no one's disputing that, but the solution was to get rid of it all. Just get rid of it all with no replacement. Compare that to the government's response about the tenement house conditions, for example, and the response to that was to build public housing, which was great. But when we obliterated housing for single adults, we replaced it with nothing, because the idea was, we don't want you to be a single adult. We want you to be something else. So I think to just say affordable housing is misleading. Even in the very robust program we have in New York for supportive housing, of which JoAnn is one of the great providers, which is a wonderful program. It's a model for the whole country. Even in supportive housing, our zoning rules require that when you build a supportive housing project, you are always leaving unbuilt square footage on the table, because you're still capped by the number of housing units you could build on that site. So there's always this disincentive to build and create housing for single people, and it's across the board. So what happens in the real housing market? New entrants to the housing market, unless, and this is true for families as well, unless you're on the very high end, you are pretty much going to be entering the underground housing world. And that's, again, much bigger than three-quarter houses. This is Craigslist. This is everything from, posters on poles in communities to going on the internet. When you go into that underground housing market, you're vulnerable legally, you're vulnerable physically, and I think, Robert's descriptions of some of the bad conditions in three-quarter houses could be exactly the same if you go into buildings that are housing low-wage workers in Chinatown, or, Somali umbrella salesmen in the Northwest Bronx. You see the same exact conditions. Illegal partitions, beds stacked up, a lot of blocking of entrances, and especially fire escapes. And so these conditions are pervasive in New York. And it's a problem that, our project, Making Room, is really about looking at the regulatory framework to try to bring the underground housing market into the light of day. We want more choice for people, not less, but we want those choices to be legal and safe. So I think for those of you here, I'm assuming most of you are here because you're really interested in this particular population. I would say that I think it's really important to build some bridges with the affordable housing community, whether it's the supportive housing groups or the local CDCs in communities, because as long as single adults, and this population in particular, are viewed as people who should be made invisible and not be incorporated into communities, the three-quarter house problems, which are real, and the people here are committed to doing something about it. But we've got to put this in a broader context, because we've got to be able to build those bridges and to link this population into communities that can also provide some support and some help for their reentry into a public life. So I would leave it at that.
Okay, so what I'd like to do,
Thank you.
what I'd like to do is kind of tighten the lens and, from a broader perspective, focus specifically on folks who have criminal justice history. So Fortune Society backed into housing, because especially if people had violent convictions, and especially if people had no clean time, even the limited and continually shrinking options were not available to them. So what we did was we created the Castle in Harlem and then Castle Gardens to speak to that unmet need. But what we do is a drop in the bucket. So we offer a whole set of wraparound services. 3 years ago, I might have said we serve 3,000 people a year. The last time I looked, it was 4,500. And these are people just out of jail, just out of prison, or not so just out of incarceration, but struggling with the issues that come with a record. And almost all of our folks come to us with three struggles: poverty, racism, and record. And most people, like 3/4 of them, come to us with substance abuse history. And a significant percentage come with mental health issues as well. So people are really struggling, but they come to us in a moment of hope, that something better is possible. And I would say out of that 4,000, 4,500 people, a minimum of 10 to 15% are homeless, and many more are very badly housed, living in a house where there's crime and drugs, living in a place where they can only stay another 10 minutes, living in a place that's really bad for them. We do a lot of referrals to three-quarter houses. And I think, well, Nancy Lopez, are you here? Yeah, wave your hand. Nancy's been at Fortune 1 week less than my 24 years. And she heads our admissions department, so she's the real expert in terms of Fortune's experience. But what do you do when you have 800, 900, 1,000 people in need of housing who walk in your door, hopeful, desperate, looking at options? There's the shelter system, there's living under a bridge, there's going to three-quarter houses. So when you sit with somebody and they have a choice between the frying pan and the fire, you help to steer them into the best frying pan you can find. And we do a lot of that. It's a shitty way to operate. Okay, we house perhaps 200 people in any year, but in terms of vacancies, if it's 50, it's a lot. So we're going to try to do another house, but it'll be another tiny, tiny drop in the bucket. So what I want to do is talk about, Jerilyn talked about the broader issue, about the shrinking availability of housing. I want to talk for a moment about why the criminal justice population has even less access to that shrinking pool, because there are policy opportunities in that. There's no protection against discrimination for record in housing. There is in employment. You need to show some kind of reason that you don't hire a person if you use record. You need to show a connection between what they got convicted of and what the job entails. And the stereotypical explanation is you don't hire a sex offender to be a school bus driver. There is no such legal protection for folks with records, including folks with records from 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So we see people come in who are the people coming out of foster care. And if you look at the trajectory of kids coming out of foster care, it's gruesome. It's prisons, it's shelters, it's miserable. And we have people in their 70s and 80s, 10, 20, 30, in some cases 40 years of incarceration, who are trying to figure out how to live in the world and have outlived their people, have no place to go, and look at the streets and shelters as more dangerous sometimes than the incarceration. So I just want to tag a couple of areas of discrimination. And because I'm limited in time, then I want to talk about points of possible intervention. One is NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority. Federal regulations only eliminate two groups of people from public housing: people who manufactured methamphetamines on public housing property and lifetime registry sex offenders. Everything else in the way of restrictions is a choice of local policy. In New York City, if you have a misdemeanor marijuana conviction, you are barred from public housing for 3 years. Okay, what happens if you got an 18-year-old kid who gets picked up for a joint during a stop and frisk? He has to leave home. Okay, that is a manufacturing of homelessness that I think is criminal. The second is federal regulations have tightened down, and housing money from federal sources under the HEARTH Act is no longer available to people who served more than 90 days in an institution. So if you served 87 days at Rikers Island and you come out homeless, you're homeless and you're eligible for services. If you have served 95 days at Rikers, or 10 or 20 or 30 years upstate, you are not homeless. You got to go live under a bridge or go to a shelter for a while. Ouch. The last is affordable housing discrimination. When we opened Castle Gardens, we were stunned to find that the organizations that do the screening for public housing for affordable housing when there's a lottery, routinely exclude people with convictions, and let them apply again and appeal it. And most people, of course, don't. So even in publicly supported housing that should be available to folks with records, the first barrier is one of discrimination. So I want to talk about 3 points of possible intervention and then pass on to Tanya. One is raise the bottom for three-quarter houses. Some of them are decent places to live. Some of them are appalling. I think targeting safety issues and targeting the mandated treatment would feel like the places to hit, in my mind, because you can't eliminate the frying pan when nothing's left but the fire. Okay? Second is to address the issues of discrimination against folks with records. Have the same kind of protections that you have in employment, which is that you have to show some kind of risk. You can't just discriminate blanket based on status. And guess what? If you want to talk about disparate racial impact, look at who's in the jails and look at who's being kept out of the little bit of affordable housing that's available. Third, we got a new administration coming. What's New York City going to look like? Are our shelters going to stay a place where people would rather live under a bridge? What stuns me is it costs about $25,000 for a shelter bed in one of those barracks-type shelters. It costs $25,000 to house somebody in our castle for a year. Why are we making those choices? So I think there are 3 points of intervention, right? In the houses themselves, raising the bottom, addressing discrimination in the same way we do in employment, and finally addressing the issue that we don't want to live in a city where the choices people have include the worst of the three-quarter houses being better than whatever else is available.
Good morning. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we do at MFY, and then I want to talk in a little more detail about a couple of the issues that Robert touched on in terms of what we see from our clients and what they're facing in the houses. Our project started 4 years ago, and we provide individual and group representation to tenants, focusing on improving conditions and preventing homelessness. We also do community legal education, and we've worked closely with Neighbors Together in Brownsville since the inception of the project. We do a legal clinic there, and together with Neighbors Together, we've organized the tenant organizing project, the three-quarter house tenant organizing project, which is essentially a tenants union fighting for change that Tasha talked a bit about. And I also just want to thank PRI enormously for their huge commitment to this research and to putting out this report. Without Robert and Tasha and the other research assistants, this would not have happened. And all of this was under the visionary leadership of Ann Jacobs, who sort of jumped on this right away. So thank you. So there's two major issues that I want to talk about that our clients face, and they're interconnected, and they are the unlawful evictions and the mandated treatment attendance. So the law in New York City is that if you've lived in a dwelling for 30 days or more, you are entitled to court process prior to eviction. You can't just be put out by your landlord. And that's true for any kind of dwelling, whether it's a three-quarter house, it's an apartment, it's a room that a person's renting in someone's house. It's the most basic protection for tenants in New York City. And this law is routinely violated in three-quarter houses, as we've learned over the past 4 years. Tenants find themselves thrown out with no notice and no court process, really as a matter of course. And normally there are a couple of things someone can do if they find themselves in that situation. A lot of people don't know that evicting someone without a court order is a crime. It's a misdemeanor. And so the first thing that a person can do is call the police. And the police are supposed to help tenants who are in that situation. They could issue a summons, they can make an arrest, but oftentimes just by threatening to do so, they can resolve the problem. Unfortunately, we've seen really mixed results from the police when tenants call about illegal evictions. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I think that, there's racism involved. I think there's judgments about people who have histories of substance abuse and criminal histories. I think that the houses also have tactics of trying to convince the police that they're exempt from the law. They have tenants sign waivers, purported waivers, that say that they're not tenants, they're program participants, even though the houses are not licensed by anyone. And they even have instructions at the bottom that say, attention law enforcement. This person can be discharged at any time, they're not a tenant. We've challenged these, and the courts have consistently agreed that, in fact, these are not enforceable contracts, but the houses do present them to the police, and it's convincing to the police, and it's convincing to tenants too. Tenants don't know that they are protected by the law. But I want to also raise, something that is a particular difficulty for people who are formerly incarcerated, and especially for people on parole, which is that calling the police is a very dicey situation for a person on parole. And oftentimes, a person on parole doesn't want to do that. They don't want to put themselves at risk of ending up arrested somehow and reincarcerated. So many times what we see is that the individual has been, finds him or herself at the curb, all of their stuff in garbage bags, on a moment's notice, with no place to go, no way to secure their belongings, and they don't feel they have an option at that moment. They don't feel calling 911 is an option. And bringing the other way to address illegal evictions is to bring an unlawful eviction case in housing court, also called a lockout case, but that takes time. So we represent people in those cases, but Friday night at 7 p.m., what are you going to do? So we see that people who have achieved some measure of stability in a moment lose that, and the progress they may have made and the stability that they may have achieved is really in jeopardy. And now they're in a crisis and they're in survival mode. And a lot of times we hear from tenants, I'm surprised to end up here, because when I first came to the house, they told me they were there as a stepping stone, to help me rebuild my life. So how is it that quite the opposite has happened? So that's, we see the unlawful evictions are really sort of the cornerstone of the three-quarter house business model. And they tie in very closely with the program participation requirement. So as Robert mentioned, in many, if not most three-quarter houses, the house mandates that people attend one specific program. If you're already connected with another program where you're doing really well, doesn't matter, gotta switch to the house's program. If you are, if you just got offered a job and there's a real opportunity for you there, doesn't matter. You've got to go to the program. You get sick, you're recovering from surgery, got to go to the program. And if you don't, then you're facing the illegal eviction. And so, aside from the in-the-moment crisis situation that unlawful evictions create, there's sort of a constant atmosphere of intimidation in many houses where people fear that they could be evicted at any moment. And so, bringing up a clogged toilet might be like, well, you could just go if you want to continue to make complaints. No heat in winter. So these are the situations that people are in where they feel even the most basic things are something that could put them at risk of becoming homeless again. And of course, the question becomes, what is that connection? Why would a landlord be so invested in their tenants going to that specific program? And what we hear over and over from tenants is there's a money thing going on. The house doesn't care so much about if I'm actually sober or if I'm actually doing well. They care about the slips that Robert mentioned earlier. And so that's where we see that unlawful evictions hand in hand with mandated program attendance really, are really essential to the profitability of three-quarter houses. Once someone completes the program successfully, they continue to go, eventually they graduate, very often they immediately find themselves on the street. And right away, there's someone new in their bed, someone who's eligible for Medicaid. And so it raises question about what the House's motivation there is. So ultimately, the very, very hard issue that led to the success of this industry and its proliferation is the lack of housing options for very low-income single adults. As Jerilyn mentioned, for single adults throughout the city, but for very low-income people, it's particularly acute. And so, we don't think a sort of wholesale enforcement approach, shutting down all the houses, is the way to go, because it doesn't address that problem, and it puts tenants in real jeopardy. Our clients tell us, we don't want to end up on the street. We just don't want it closed down. We want decent conditions. We want options. So we think there's a number of ways that we could approach it, and we think we need more ideas as well. One is the city laws that have contributed to the diminishment of housing options like single-room occupancy hotels, as Jerilyn mentioned. That needs to change. The amount that public assistance pays in rent for a single adult has been $215 a month for years and years. That doesn't even pay for half a room, let alone renting a room. That needs to change. There needs to be a commitment to fund transitional and permanent housing for people coming out of substance abuse programs and coming out of prisons and jails. And there are some other things, that could be done as well. The shelter system, as Robert mentioned, adopted a referrals policy that requires that before a referral to a three-quarter house is made, the shelter staff look at the publicly available information on city websites to make sure that there aren't certain kind of violations in place. We believe that those kinds of restrictions should also protect clients of the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, people coming out of substance abuse programs. That rule did make a difference in shelters. We're not sure that it makes sense to apply that to parole, because we hear from our clients, if I didn't have the three-quarter house address, I wouldn't have been released. And incarceration is worse than the worst three-quarter house. So I think there are other things we could talk about in terms of how, the criminal justice system might work with three-quarter houses around what their policies and practices are and what their conditions are. But I'm just very glad to see so many stakeholders here. There's obviously a lot of interest in this, and so we hope this is really the beginning of working together for solutions, and that people will get involved so that conditions in the current houses can improve, and that there can be some other decent options for people. Thank you.
So I want to thank all of the discussants. And before I open it up for questions from the floor, I'm wondering if you have any questions for each other.
I guess not so much a question, but I guess I'd be interested in hearing people's comments from everybody about, the need to try to kind of create a broader coalition on this issue, because again, while, not to take away any of the real hard sort of rubber hits the road kind of recommendations that you're talking about, as long as single adults, let alone single adults with incarceration backgrounds, but all single adults are viewed as an anathema in communities. I mean, and I get this pushback from, very nice community development not-for-profits who have been working very hard in their neighborhoods, who say things to me like, well, single people, who wants them? They're transient. They don't help build community. Half the time I say, aren't you single? I think you are, but okay. But all right, so how can we kind of broaden the coalition, not to dilute your message, but to build some bridges with sort of a broader community focus that would make housing for this population more incorporated in a general way in the kind of housing that is in communities now?
Well, remarkably, that was my question too, and I hoped you would. I would hope you would speak to it first, because I think that you come from this world that you're encouraging us to reach out to, and we don't necessarily think in the way that they do about things. So, maybe you could take the first shot at this, and then we'll go down the line.
Well, I think you started, I mean, Robert was saying that, his research was helped along the way by people like from the Corporation for Supportive Housing and, and others. And so, clearly these are organizations that are very committed to the single adult population, particularly those with special needs, and so that's a start. I do also think there needs to be some discussion with kind of the more neighborhood-based community organizations, because again, like a community that works could work as well for this population as, a building, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting is that if you pull back and look at the broader population issues, we're seeing fewer and fewer families and more singles across demographics and across economics. And there's been a really interesting